So how do we deal with the hurts and wounds that come our way? How do you deal with them? Some time ago, I sat over lunch with a friend I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. There was so much ground to cover, but our talk quickly focused on the trauma he had gone through over the last 5 years or so. In that time, he had come to find out that his wife had been involved in a series of extramarital affairs, had managed to spend up virtually all of the couple's savings, and had caused great pain to their children. Even though my friend had known the full story over 2 years, the rage and shock were still raw. He said to me, "I know I need to forgive her, but how could I even begin? How do I forgive?" With wounds such as these, or with wounds much smaller, our question is the same. So how do we forgive? Today's gospel is the second in a row in which Jesus talks about the fundamental human need for us to forgive each other. For a species such as ours, riddled with short tempers and cruelty and self-righteousness and betrayal, forgiveness is not a luxury. We humans cannot live without it. You may know the old story about a woman who was having her portrait painted. When it was finished, she complained, "It doesn't do me justice." To which the artist then replied, "Madam, it isn't justice you need, it's mercy." And isn't mercy the deepest need of all? The past bears its full share of failures and disappointments and wounds. So the question is, what power will hold force in our lives? Will the claims of the past own us? Or is it possible for us to move beyond the painful parts and to find our way to freedom? In fact, Jesus put forgiveness at the center of his teaching. It's at the heart of the one prayer he taught: "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others who trespass against us." Often when he encountered someone who was in trouble of any kind, the first thing he would say was, "Your sins are forgiven." He told stories of prodigal sons and lost sheep and lost coins, which are all stories of forgiveness and reconciliation. And of course, he died on a cross saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." In our gospel lesson this morning, Peter asked Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church should sin against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 70 times?" In other words, he's saying, how much? What are the limits? When can I stop forgiving? When do I get to say, "That's it, I'm not trying anymore"? But Jesus replies, "Not 7 times, I tell you, but 77 times," which is to say, the forgiving never stops. There is no real whole life without forgiveness. Forgiveness for Jesus isn't simply an isolated act. He says it's a way of life for us as individuals, and God knows for us in community. Of course, so much of the worst cruelty of the last century has been because of people's unwillingness to forgive. Many historians say that the Second World War might never have happened if the Allied powers had been less vengeful toward Germany after defeating it in the First World War. And then just look at what goes on day in, day out, year in, year out, decade out in Israel and Palestine. Both sides have been damaged immeasurably by the hatred, and yet both sides remain locked in the hatreds of the past that makes shaping a hopeful future to this day look almost impossible. It reminds me of a former inmate of a Nazi concentration camp who visited a friend who'd been in the camp with him. They got together and the one asked the other, "So, have you forgiven the Nazis?" "Yes," his friend said. "After some time, I have." "Well, I haven't," the other friend said. "I'm still consumed with hatred for them." And the other friend replied, in that case, they still have you in prison. Into this bitter web of wounding we human beings are parts of comes Jesus calling us to what you can only call the miracle of forgiveness. It's a miracle because it shatters the chain of cause and effect. It can change how life, how history flows. It sets people free from prisons of hatred and recrimination. It heals relationships and creates the possibility of living again. We should be clear what forgiveness is not, though. Forgiveness doesn't mean saying that the offense never happened, because it did. It isn't saying that everything is right away okay, because it's probably not. Forgiving is not forgetting. Memories linger, and they should. It's about remembering that a person is more than this act that has hurt me. And it means remembering that I, too, have a history and that I have hurt people. Forgiveness doesn't depend on the other person's being sorry. Sorrow makes it easier, but forgiveness is not about the other person. It's about me. It's about changing how I see and relate to someone who has hurt me. Forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be punishment or consequences or restitution. Society has laws for our life together, and they need to be honored. And finally, forgiveness doesn't mean staying in a destructive situation. The struggle to forgive also calls us to refuse to be wounded continually, either by a harsh employer or an abusive spouse or any other destructive relationship. Forgiveness has its own clear message. I am furious for you for what you have done. It has hurt me and continues to, but I know that you are more than what you have done to me, and I know that we both need God's forgiveness. I want to let go of this and begin again with a clean slate and leave the rest in God's hands. At its core, forgiveness is about discovering who I am in relation to God and everyone else. It's what Jesus is getting at in that parable he tells in the gospel this morning of a palace servant who was forgiven a vast debt of 10,000 talents and then refused to forgive a tiny amount. Forgiveness, Jesus is saying, begins not with an act, but a recognition that all of us are in debt and all of us need mercy. This forgiveness is a refusal to go the way of arrogance and self-righteousness that so easily seeps into our inner lives, especially in this 21st century. The Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who lived first under the Nazism and then through all of the killing back and forth in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, wrote a simple poem of what it takes for healing to begin. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow. And so the heart of forgiveness is a profound act of letting go of our rightness. The word for forgiveness is Greek and Aramaic. In the Greek and Aramaic would have been spoken as something like, we are called to release and surrender where we have been hurt. We decide to release our grip on the anger and hurt and claim our place in God's love. The steps of forgiving are simple, but not easy. First, face up to the hurt and decide to take your time in this work of forgiveness. Second, when the pain washes over you, keep letting go of it as much as you can. Slowly, it will get easier. And most importantly, pray for the ability to forgive, and pray for the person who hurt you. Try to see that person in the light of God's love. Ask for the healing power of Christ to enable you to release the anger. Sometimes healing takes years. In one of her books, writer Anne Lamott described her struggles to forgive her mother for several years. She says, "I prayed for my heart to soften, to forgive her, and to love her for what she did for me, but it was so hard. I was able to say thanks for those good things like great values, a lot of tennis lessons, and that was about the best she could do. Unfortunately, the best she could do was terrible, and my heart remained hardened." And so Lamott says, for the first 2 years after her mother's death, she kept her mother's ashes in her son's closet. But slowly she was able to move them to the corner of the living room, and that was for her a major event. She says that Jesus understands that things like forgiving a mother can take time. I don't think he was rolling his eyes impatiently at me while she was still in the closet. I don't think much surprises him. This is how we make important changes, she says. Barely, poorly, slowly. And still, Jesus raises his fist in triumph when we do it. Many of you, I suspect, have come across the NPR program StoryCorps, in which people speak of key moments in their lives. On a Saturday afternoon recently, while driving around Boston, I happened to hear the story of Hector Black, a gentle-voiced organic farmer in Tennessee. As he recounted the story of how his daughter was murdered when an intruder broke into her home in Atlanta, with sadness and grace he described the terrible murder and how it devastated him. Nothing like that had ever happened, he explained. I mean, we'd known death, but never anything like this. I'd never been in favor of the death penalty, but I wanted that man to hurt the way he had hurt her. I wanted him to hurt the way I was hurting. But after a while, Hector decided to find out what kind of monster could have done what he did to his daughter. And he learned that the killer was born in a mental hospital to a deeply violent mother who had killed one of her children and tried to do more. So when Hector, a little later, appeared in district court, the district attorney was upset when Hector refused to ask for the death penalty for the killer. And when the moment came for Hector to be able to speak, he stood up to address the killer and said, "I don't hate you, Ivan Simpson, but I hate with all my soul what you did to my daughter." And Hector says he looked in Simpson's eyes and tears were streaming down his cheek. And finally, Simpson himself asked to speak, and he stood up and went to the microphone and said twice over how deeply, deeply sorry he was for what he had done. When I got back to my room that night, Hector recalls, I couldn't sleep because I really felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from me and that I had forgiven him. How many times must I forgive? Peter asks. Peter's looking for limits on his relationships with his neighbor, limits on the demands of God. But Jesus refuses to take that up 77 times. In other words, there is no counting. Because there are no limits on the times we will hurt and be hurt, no limits on the love that forgives you and that forgives me, and no limits on the power of Christ to heal our past and set us free.